I want to go back and just kind of briefly, today's topic is about protection issues and solutions for LGBTIQ plus persons, and that's for that group of people in the context of forced displacement. We've seen from B's presentation, just some really incredible research around what happens to those people who do manage to access the system. And we don't know how many people are accessing the system versus how many people are not accessing the system. But what we do know is that there should be a role in terms of international protection for people who are accessing the system, and ways that international protection can be expanded so that those who are not yet accessing the system do. And I think that Masi's presentation really put that into perspective, because it showed the kind of lived realities of what is happening to many people who don't access the system. Of course, this is one country's context, and it's one country among many. I think that we could have a conversation about what happens in countries in the global north, or even in countries where the encampment system is a reality. And I think that what really kind of brings all of this home is what you've shown us, Tina, about the global pledges. And I was particularly interested in the aspect where there's no reporting system, and in one way the pledges are almost the only way that one can have an informal type of reporting, and so to have less than 1% of them even speak to LGBT issues is shocking. Maybe just to kind of plug that you can still pledge, and so it might be worth kind of thinking about how is there a way to expand the space for LGBTQI plus individuals through revisiting the pledge system and making more pledges that are LGBTQI specific. And I want to highlight that based on one other thing, and then I'm going to open the floor to comments, and we'll start also with a question that Nick has posed in the chat box to B. But this was something that is not my idea, but it was mentioned by a colleague in another forum, which is that we are almost 10 years into having the guidelines on international protection number 9, which is the specific one that relates to sexual orientation and or gender identity. I'm stopping at gender identity because that's the wording they use. And so perhaps there is scope within the pledge system to revisit a decade later those guidelines and to update them. And that might be something that could be used in order to bring all of these experiences together, the experiences of access, the experiences of inaccess, and the lived realities, and putting that into law and onto paper. So that's just my kind of stumbling attempt to bring everyone's presentations together. And so now I'd like to, I see that there are 2 questions. One is for B, and then the next is for B and Tina. So B, if I can hand over to you, Nick is asking if you could speak a little more about your role with UNHCR running the series of roundtables on these issues, and if there are any interesting outputs.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Sally. I mean, I think this is a great way to kind of segue off Sally's last comment, and Tina was also involved with the roundtable discussion. So for all of June, I can't even believe it was this year. It's been, I mean, Tina, I'm sure you feel the same way. It was really intense. There were a series of roundtable discussions and acknowledgement that it is coming up. Well, it has been 10 years since the first discussion around the inclusion of sexual orientation and gender identity, and an awareness that we are coming up on 10 years to number 9, and that it is largely outdated. And as I mentioned in my presentation, it never imagined that refuge would be in the global south. So many of the ways in which LGBT asylum cases are managed currently don't take into account systems, spaces. For instance, this I mentioned the parallel legal system. There's an idea that you would move north, you would have safety, you would integrate, you would start your new life. And there's no real structures for how this is supposed to work in the South, yet we have the highest number of LGBTI people living in forced migration circumstances. So I'm going to drop it in the chat box. The end of this insane month was a document with, which was a summary of the tables with a kind of call for the things that we wanted to change about the international asylum system as it pertains to LGBT people. I would say overall, it was an interesting event. I did have a number of critiques, including the fact that I think it was poorly advertised. There wasn't a lot of media around it. This meant that there wasn't a lot of involvement of people other than those that were well known doing LGBTI refugee work. I hosted the roundtable on trans issues, and we were basically, I called it the kind of last chance saloon, because we were given 3 topics. So we had to do refoulement, trans issues, and detention in one session, which is insane. And the other interesting thing, and I think this deserves more discussion, is that many people, particularly in an online forum, struggle to speak about, and were quite open about their reluctance to speak about trans people in asylum for fear of gender critical people being in the room and the backlash that that might cause on their organizations, and what that would mean for them personally. I think that the document is a really great indication of where the direction we should be heading in. So for instance, in terms of trans people, we've asked that we think that the UNHCR should be providing documentation from the outset in the correct gender that a person applies in, regardless of what country of origin documents say. The same you would with someone who was stateless or had documents that weren't usable. If you're going to provide protection and you acknowledge this person is seeking on the basis of being trans, then it seems almost nonsensical to then re-provide this documents in the same sex from country of origin, because you just create the same effect of discrimination in country of refuge. And there are many really incisive and really groundbreaking, I think, requests being made around how the system might work better for LGBT people and how it might acknowledge them. I think the roundtable, there was a lot of work done for free by a lot of people who are not in a position to do work for free. And when you then put all those people online, when you had a budget before, many of us are asking, well, what happened to your massive budget that was meant to fly everyone to a place to do this in the first place? And how are you sponsoring people who are literally talking to you from a refugee camp and requiring and relying on you for resettlement? They're not going to be critical of the things that you are offering, because at the end of the day, your name is on a list in their system. And one of the other key things that I think came out of it that I really, and it touches on points made earlier, there is, in the current UNHCR system, there is, on progress, there is no way to indicate that someone is LGBT. So what that happens then is that there is, every person who comes into contact with a file needs to kind of be a kind of benevolent engager to check if there's any notes connected to that file to say if a person is lesbian or gay or transgender. What happens most often is that these files are tagged as SGBV files. So even if you've never experienced gender-based violence, that's what's most often going to appear on your file as a hint that you might be LGBT, which is an insane situation. And it was one of the clear requests made that progress in some way, shape, or form needs to have room to indicate the actual gender of someone applying, and that they're applying on the basis of sexual orientation. Thanks, Nick.
Can I add a bit of a reflection to the roundtable? Because I think I'm probably more sort of critical about it than sort of hopeful that it did bring a bit of I don't know, momentum or solidarity. And I totally share your comments, B, and in particular, I guess the issue that the roundtable was the invitation only roundtable. And I think that in itself sort of creates, right, like that sort of an exclusionary already practice, sort of who is deserving to be in the room, who's not, the whole idea of people only being able to attend 2 out of the 13 sessions. Again, what I found interesting is that despite UNHCR sort of willing to say the roundtable actually was centering really lived experience of forcibly displaced people, I think the event was about this group and not definitely for this group, because if you analyze the program, there was not a single session, for example, even focusing on LGBTIQ refugee-led work that is actually happening in so many places, right? And then, you know, you have the opening plenary with 5 people having refugee backgrounds, who are thanked for their testimonies. And we're like, but I mean, we're so far beyond this, you know, the time where we keep sharing these stories, and yet even though people sort of were briefed that you could tell anything, but when the moderator thanks you for your testimony, it kind of really puts it back into perspectives, you know, what your role meant to be there. I find it really also interesting that there was sort of real lack of that analysis and segregation by different identities within LGBTIQ+, right? Like what you say, be the trans issues was sort of put together with something else. We didn't get to talk about intersex people, we don't get to talk about bisexual people, you know, like how does discrimination looks for them. And one of the main thing is there's no sort of responsible person or responsible body for the implementation of those recommendations. I think UNHCR made it so clear so many times, we are not the ones. Please do not address recommendations to us because we are not the ones to do it. It's all of you. But once we say all of you, it's like nobody of you, right? So I think, you know, it's good to have these 38 recommendations in place. For me, at some points, it did feel like, okay, somebody learns this today, that's fine. We have to be patient. The issues have been known there for a really long time, but we'll listen to this, okay? But I hope that kind of brings some, and did bring some traction, but I think not having that accountability mechanisms, again, then coupled back to what you, Sally, was saying, there is no reporting, all of that is voluntarily. We can't measure the progress and we can't hold people accountable for the fact that some changes are actually really easy if you have political will. And in many places, there is no will to actually even do those changes.
Thanks, Bea and Tina. And yeah, I completely agree. Some places there definitely is no political will. And I'm going to abuse my position as chair to just come back to Masi. And, you know, I mean, we've heard about gaps in law, in legal mechanisms, but I wonder if you can share with us kind of gaps that you see that would really provide a substantive difference, because it's all very well for me to kind of mention general comment number 9 and the 10-year anniversary and the need for a revision of that. But I think that what you said is far more important than the need for a revision of general comment number 9. And so, yeah, just any gaps that you would like to identify, or if you want to, I don't know, if there was a wish list and you could have 5 things that would help now, what would they be?
All right. Thank you so much, Sally. I think the first and the foremost thing that would be on the first wish list for us as the LGBTI migrants or refugee or asylum seekers here in South Africa was to perhaps get, I'm not saying we want maybe a special treatment or something, but we need to get maybe the Home Affairs officials a bit educated on the LGBTI and queue to receive us in their offices. Because as I have said to you, most of the times you get there to the office, you get there as a normal person that is looking for asylum, and then they give you the form, then you state in your form, of course, because you can't be standing in the queue and like waving it out to say I'm LGBTIQ, because as you know, the people that are also coming to the Home Affairs are also from our home countries. So you fear of discrimination and, you know, like being followed around and all of those things, because most of us did really run away from home to come and look for a safe place, greener pastures here. So if there was a gap that could be there, that would be maybe getting a day that all the LGBTIQ to the Home Affairs and any hindrances. And as I said, the Home Affairs officers, for them to be educated on how to treat us as fellow human beings. We've got our own rights. The second thing that I can have on my wish list is education. That is the second wish on my wish list, to say if we could get some organizations that would be willing or would look for funds for us to get maybe the general GED. In Pachedu, we are like 60 people, and of those 60 people, you can see that most of us, like let's say 70% of us have not had the GED, or maybe we did have GEDs, we did go to school, to colleges back home, but because the way we came here, we ran away from home, we left all the documentation, and we do not know how to, or we don't have any proof of us being educated or equally educated. That is now making us stay in the informal sectors. If that could help, it would help. The third thing that I'll say is on my wish list is for us to be like medication, to get like access to medication without being either violated or discriminated for us being LGBTI, from the LGBTI community. We need maybe you get some clinics that are like, well, as I said, in Langa, in Guguletu, in the high density suburbs, whereby those people are fellow people that don't understand or refuse to get to understand that we are people that are living, we exist, and they still make a life difficult for us to just get a general medication. That will be the third thing on my wish list. The fourth thing on my wish list is that we've had we ever since I came here, if it wasn't of me stretching out my hand to say we want to be part of the community, would like to have like more organizations that are in South Africa that would also maybe recognize us as the LGBTI migrants, and sort of include us in their activities that they do, maybe monthly activities. Maybe if we could have some workshops that could help us, or maybe get us all inclined into one spectrum. And then the fifth thing that I would ask for is I've gone around personally. I've gone around to a lot of shelters that are here in Cape Town, and the LGBTI, some of the LGBTI shelters, citing that the people have been chucked away from their houses. They've been evicted from their houses because of COVID. It has hit everyone else. If you try to get maybe some accommodation for some of the members, that now we have to go into the streets and look for and give food and give the vouchers that we get from B, from the food basket and from Triangle. But if we could get maybe some organizations that can have shelters for the migrants that are not part of the are not documented, that would be something that would be thankful about. Last but and not least is thank you guys for this platform that you've given us. It's actually an eye opener, and I've learned a lot of things on it. Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much, Nyasha. And yeah, I mean, I've just on your last point on the issue of shelters, I mean, there are so few of them, and it's certainly something that is not specific to South Africa when it comes to safe spaces and shelters for LGBTQI plus individuals and asylum seekers and refugees specifically. I'm going to loop back now and go to the question which was for B and Tina. So the question in the chat from Kuda to B and Tina is two parts. One, what is driving these particular forms of exclusion? And two, how can we ensure that the language of gender is more inclusive? So maybe, shall we start with you, Tina, and then over to you, B?
Thanks. I think this is a really excellent question.
If you'd like to interrupt each other in as well, you're welcome to do that. Go ahead.
Let's try to do that. In terms of, I think, what's driving the particular forms of exclusion, I can clearly say that, you know, it is homophobia and transphobia. It is that complete disregard for the lives. And I also think that if I reflect back on one of the meetings for the Global Compact on Refugees, was that it begins with a video that Holy See decided to show at the beginning of the session, which was actually a breach of protocol. But they showed this video sort of like of benevolence of, you know, the church and everything, right? And I think it's kind of, you've got those narratives and you've got those alliances being built at such high level as UN that really, you know, disregard, I guess, the existence of LGBTIQ+. I think we always have to come back to the roots where that all stems from, and we know that homophobia and transphobia stems from colonialism, and it was the gifts from British, from Spanish, and into the rest of the world. And I guess we have to be coming back to that you know, it's not that it's been brought by the West, the sexuality and gender and bodily diversity, but actually always been there for centuries and centuries. But I guess rather sort of more conservative views there. But also what I see on a more practical kind of level is indifference. And I think the indifference is a bit even worse, because at least when an open kind of hostility, you know that that's there. But the indifference, and I see, for example, in Australia, we have like settlement sector that works with refugees. And I would hear from people tell me, well, we don't have any LGBTQ clients, like that's for sure. And you'd be like, but do you even ask? Do you collect data? No, so you don't even know, right? But they sort of think, well, that's not my issue. I'm not a specialist. I'm not going to engage with this. And that would kind of perpetuate that othering and marginalization as well. In terms of the language of gender, I think the problem is that people approach it from the different sort of points of view, because actually people approach language of gender from what it actually means, right? That sort of a power, that system that really governs your lives and really like assigns you, you know, how you perceived in the world, like how you can move through the world. We actually would be on the inclusive space. In the UN space, what really we see is that sort of a sex-based, right? Like segregation, you know, we talk about women and girls. And then I think the reason why the compact even mentioned men and boys, because there was a backlash, like, well, what about men and boys, right? Like, what about them? And it's like, well, but if we actually really meaningfully talked about gender, what we would do, we would talk about the impacts of patriarchy, of, you know, how ideas of masculinity and femininity are there, you know, like who gets to be seen, you know, as the breadwinner, and, you know, and why, for example, a single woman household is going to be, you know, targeted more. We would see the impacts of why LGBTIQ+ people become targets, you know, because they're sort of defying whatever is the acceptable binary and whatnot. And I think but it has to be spelled out, because we can't ever assume. And it's the same, like, you know, we say intersectionality, but people mean a whole lot of different things. And unless you actually work it through together, that you're on the same page, you do get this sort of outcomes. People say, yeah, gender, however, here's my list of exclusions who I will exclude from the gender, because sort of that's my view, as opposed to a widely sort of accepted practice and a definition.
I mean, yeah, I think Tina's covered it. I think, you know, one of the things, the word woman, the word gender is in all these things, but we know that it doesn't, what it means often, it's like when you have women's studies departments that became gender studies departments, there's still women's studies departments. The idea is about what is a woman, and it's very narrowly defined. The ways in which we begin to challenge that is actually unfortunate. Well, not unfortunately, because we all perpetuate that system, some of us more than others. When we are writing about women, what do we actually mean? Does that include trans women? Trans is just an adjective for the kind of woman. We know that we have to literally say and trans women, even if women is in there. Our notions of gender on an individual level need to become more expansive for us to be able to read into these documents the things that should be there in the first place. So that comes, I mean, that's like basic everyday steps, like many of us here have our pronouns in our names to remind you that gender is more expansive. When we started this discussion, we didn't say welcome ladies and gentlemen because we recognize that that's exclusionary. It's those small steps that indicate an idea of exclusion and inclusion and prompt a kind of wider culture around gender that has a long-term effect on when it comes down to how we write policy and who we imagine policy to include. Because as Suma Abdulsami, a trans woman who presented at the roundtable, said, you know, she's in Turkey, she's a trans woman, she goes to get a grant for women, and they say, well, no, you're a trans woman, so that means you're a single male, so you don't get the grant for women. So she's like, well, are there grants for people like me? And they're like, no, there's no grants for people like you. So she's like, well, what job should I do then? Because I can't do a single male job. And so they say, well, we know what kinds of jobs we think you should do. And she basically was told that the only thing she could do was sex work, and they recognize that. But they can't help her because these two categories are the only ways in which they imagine the people that are being served. And she doesn't fit into those categories on their account of what gender means. So I think for me, it's about individually the ways in which we all work and think and imagine in the world. And at a broader level, it is always asking that question, okay, you've said women, but do you mean all women? Yeah, so it's an individual and a wider practice, I think, in terms of language.
Thanks, Bea, and thanks Tina. Kuda, please jump in if you have any follow-ups to those questions based on what Bea and Tina have just said. But I'm pivoting back now to Inamusa's comment in the chat box, which is linked to what Nyasha provided, which was, and I hope I do justice in summary, Nyasha, but when I asked what your list would be, you spoke about training of Home Affairs officials and sensitization. You spoke about access to education, including some way of accessing documents that may have been left behind that show what level of education one already has, and the kind of recognition of those levels in your now home country. You spoke about access to medication, so access to healthcare, then workshops and shelters. And so I see that Inamusa's comment says that, you know, this is for everyone. And when I see everyone, I'm going to include everyone, including people who are in the audience, not just on the panel. But in line with what Nyasha has said, what are the sustainable solutions? And there could be sustainable solutions in law, and there could be sustainable solutions kind of quite practically. So I'm inviting panelists to talk about sustainable solutions from all levels and all angles. So I
think the same problem emerges with xenophobia when we say we should train people or educate people. Does that do justice to the kind of intervention that would be needed to address some of this discrimination? Sorry for that, Sally. I just thought it would be a good way to bring the contribution together.
Thanks, Kuda.
Thanks.
And I agree with you, Kuda. I think it's what I, for example, find problematic, and maybe I'm speaking sort of from the Australian context on this, but where people say we need to do a sensitivity training, right? what about human rights approach, right? Like, we don't need to make people tolerate us, right? Or be sensitive to this difference. You know, there's nothing different, you know, from, you know, in me or, you know, compared to, let's say, to a straight person, right? For, you know, for them to have more human rights than for me to have that. And I think it has to be that sort of a change and a shift into how we also even frame what are we training people to do. We at FDPN run quite a few trainings on LGBTIQ plus inclusion, but specifically focusing on displaced people for various services. And sometimes in being very blunt, and I say, well, if you as a refugee organization cannot bring yourself to supporting these people, you should be out of job, right? Like, your basic job description is that you do the human rights work. And if there are these sort of terms and conditions, you should be out of job if you're just incapable of doing your job. And I know that it's probably, you know, easier to say in some contexts, and I know that in other contexts it is so much harder. But I agree that it has to be more about the practice, not just the sort of the knowledge. And I guess a lot of the training also will say, here all these issues that people experience, right? And again, kind of putting them into a victimizing state, and we're not necessarily looking at their solutions. So like with, for example, you know, work on racism, like it has to be the anti-racism work, not just we're kind of talking about the cultural harmony and that kind of stuff. I want to touch on other few things in response to the question in terms of like this practical needs. And I wanted to sort of mention and kind of question, where is the LGBTIQ plus sector and LGBTIQ plus sort of general human rights work in all of this? In Australia, what we see is the whole discourse is like super wide and super centric on the citizens, right? With COVID, it was really highlighted how a lot of government announcements of what sort of, you know, new changes that happened, social security support, the, you know, medical health over the phone, all of that is for people who are citizens, right? Or who are on a permanent visas. And so once you're not eligible for like this state-funded medical care or social security, you miss out. But like the LGBTIQ organizations, despite, you know, like the issue of displacement for queer and trans people, it's one of the most pressing issues at the moment, right? And LGBTIQ plus sector hasn't caught up yet. They're sort of still caught up in their own struggles on national levels, as opposed to actually looking at those people who come to the countries. And the other point, I think, what is really important is that resourcing and funding and sort of a sustainability and capacity building for LGBTIQ plus refugee organizations. You know, what Masi was talking about, you know, if you guys had more funds to be supporting those people, you'd be doing that. But we also have the way how all of the grants are structured. You have to be already with experience, already with budgets, already with like legal status and registration and particular legal types of status to even be able to access that funding. And then that funding is also really, you know, just kind of, you know, crumbles everywhere because they don't want to give that money. And what we then see, a lot of money goes to real large organizations. They're not doing the job. And then you've got people who do the job, who have no money to do the job, and who just stretch to the capacity with a huge impact on them, because supporting your own community is actually, it's really emotionally taxing on you, because you really want to help and you exactly know what it feels like, but not always you can. And maybe you could if you actually were a bit more resourced. So I think it's kind of those things that have to be also changing, you know, for that sort of a better support.
Thanks, Tina. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, B.
No, I mean, I agree almost with everything Tina said. I think one of the important things that Tina raises, though, is that we are, at least in the spaces we're speaking from, we're in the fortunate position, and I think we often forget this when we talk about training, is that it's all fair and well to train people, but at the end of the day, this is actually your job. This is what you signed up to do in the country with these guidelines and these rights. So we train people, sure, we educate them, but at the end of the day, this is your job. You get paid to do it. Why at your job do you have a Bible in your desk that you feel is acceptable to bring out and hand over to clients? You're a frontline worker, that's it. And so I think that sometimes my concern or worry is that we are gentle in this idea, well, if they understood, if we provided more information, at the end of the day, you're a government employee, you live in a place where this is what's outlined is supposed to happen, this is your job. And I think that often that is something that we need to stress a lot more. The other thing that I think touches on Kritta's point a little bit, and COVID somehow, this I would say is one of the positive effects of COVID, surprisingly, is that we often see, and Tina's mentioning it, you know, the LGBT people who are citizens are doing their own work, and then LGBT people who are not citizens are doing their own work over here. But the rights that LGBT people are asking for in country often affect those people that are not citizens. So, you know, when we're writing up a document, as an example, for extending legal gender recognition, that must include what would happen to refugee papers and asylum seeker papers. We have to start pressing LGBT groups with citizenship to start imagining refugees, asylum seekers, people in forced migration as part of their constituencies. These groups are too small to do the work on their own and often arrive, you know, 5 years after an act has been implemented, and they're like, oh, I want to change my refugee documents. Now what do I do? I'm like with 3 refugees who need this done. So there's two, it's pressing people to imagine their constituencies as wider than just citizens and wider than just their own state.
Thanks, B. I mean, I think that your point on citizen privilege is, just a really important one. And what Tina said reminded me of something that really frustrated me throughout the lockdown and continues to, which was every time that the president addressed the country, he would stand up and he would say, "My fellow South Africans." And I think that that sort of speaks volumes to who is being spoken to about something as important as a national lockdown, and it begins to trickle down to how it impacts on people. And so what Nyasha said earlier about, you know, who was getting or losing their jobs and who was getting grants, who was getting support from the government during the lockdown, you can kind of go all the way up to that initial step, which is my fellow South Africans. Thank you very, very much to all of the panelists. Thank you so much to everyone who's contributed here.